Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome. I'm Tamsin Rose, and I am the moderator for you this afternoon. And what a topic we have to discuss. We're going to be talking about combating illicit financial flows, the impact that has on Africa and its future economic prosperity and development, the role of Europe in addressing these issues, and how we can move from policy ideas and statements to real action. This is the second in a series of conversations that we're holding that are linked to the AU-EU tracker. In February last year, the AU and the EU held a high-level summit, and they set out a series of commitments that they made. And here at the Africa Foundation, we are tracking delivery. We want to track the progress on the commitments that were made and make sure that when you get a high-level policy document, it results in real change on the ground. So this is the second dialogue in that series linked to the AU-EU tracker. So welcome, and you will be part of this conversation. We have a number of high-level experts who are going to share their insights and their perspectives, but you make this conversation work. So you can interact with us by using the chat on the Zoom function. You can put your comments and your contributions, and I will be opening the floor, and we'll get through as many of your questions as we can in the time that we have. So that's how you would engage with us. So now I'd like to pass the floor to Mo Ibrahim, who's the co-founder of the Africa Europe Foundation, to set the scene for us. Mo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamsin, and I think this is an important discussion, especially for us in Africa. Illicit financial flow has been a major problem for us, which is always swept under the carpet. Various estimates. It's difficult to estimate how much Africa is losing because of illicit financial flow, because by its nature, it's difficult really to measure. But various estimates between 80 billion a year and 107 billion a year are produced by United Nations, by American academics, etc. So it is somewhere in that.
Recording in progress.
And just to compare that with the total amount of aid Africa is receiving, is really show us how important this is. This is more than double the amount of aid Africa is receiving every year. It's estimated that in the last 40 or 50 years, Africa lost about $1 trillion. Imagine what that would have done to the African communities. How many schools, how many hospitals, how many infrastructure, how much. It's a huge amount of money. And we keep raising that issue. Unfortunately, we don't see much action from the developed countries on that issue. Not much has been done. And interestingly, recently, both UK and France noticed that big multinationals don't pay enough taxes in their countries, and through financial engineering, taking sales to a company in Ireland, for example, which have a sweet deal, and it's essentially profit shifting, and they kick the big fuss. And so it's only when it started to hurt our friends in the West, they started to take notice. And as a result, in one of the G meetings, I think the G20 meetings, asked the OECD to look into this issue. And the OECD produced some reports, actually like 4 or 5 books on base erosion and profit shifting, which was one step in the right direction, not a complete answer to our problems. And but since then, these books are carrying dust, nothing happened. And we raised that issue at the Africa Summit, Africa Europe Summit last year, and it was included, fortunately, in the communique. And it's a commitment now And we would like to see what happens. So far, when I ask what's going on, people talk about money laundering, talk about corruption, but the basic issue is really, in my view, and according to the numbers, is the profit shifting actually. And the big culprit here, the main culprits are the multinational companies. And it seems to me, both our friends in Europe and US, etc., are a little bit reluctant to deal with their own companies and how to deal with this. I'm delighted today that I have on the panel really some of the experts and practitioners who are really know about this much more than me, I would say. And I look forward to hear from them how we're going to go forward, what needed to be done by whom. And it seems to me action need to be taken on the capitals of the developed countries whose companies are causing these problems. I would like to hear your views on how that can be done, but we will not go quiet. We'll keep pushing for this issue. I stop here to really listen to our wonderful panel about a way forward. Thank you, Tasman.
Thank you very much. And again, you've highlighted just how much money we're talking about. It's quite extraordinary when you think the enormous amounts of efforts that are being put into ODA, that over the last 50 years, all of that amount is smaller than the amount that has flowed out of Africa, as you said, Mo, largely towards multinational companies. So this is an area that requires serious thought and serious progress. Let me introduce our first panel member who's going to give us some perspective, and that's Dr. Adeyemi Dipeolu, who's the former special advisor to the President for Economic Matters of the Vice President of Osinbajo of Nigeria, and he's also a former member of the Technical Committee and head of the Secretariat of the High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows. Now, your high-level panel made a number of really important recommendations. What I want to know is what's stopping us from implementing those recommendations, and how could we get that moving and really get better governance in place?
Thank you very much. And let me start by thanking the Africa Europe Foundation for inviting me to take part in this important discussion. As you said, quite a lot of work has been done on illicit financial flows, IFFs, such as the production of several reports, including the high-level panel on illicit financial flows from Africa, the HLP, as well as dynamic and active advocacy by civil society organizations. What this means is that there is a great deal of clarity about IFFs, which consist of commercial, criminal, and corrupt activities. We're also better informed about how and where they take place, the scale of resources involved, the drivers and enablers, and the impact of IFFs, and what needs to be done. African countries are doing their part at national and regional levels to implement as much of the recommendations as they can. But as the high-level panel stresses, lasting solutions depend on international cooperation. Africa's partners, which in this particular context means Europe, need to step up to the plate, because it is the developed countries that have the legal regimes that enable hidden accumulation of wealth, host the multinational corporations that are the greatest patrons of financial secrecy jurisdictions, and who also hardly penalize trade misinvoicing and manipulation of trade transactions. SDG 16.4, which called for the elimination of IFFs, was signed up to by the international community and provides a good opportunity for collaboration. Instead, what we are seeing are subtle and sometimes unsubtle attempts to separate abusive tax practices from money laundering and corruption in the fight against IFFs. This cannot be the case because the commercial component of illicit financial flows is the largest part, accounting for about 66%. Then also, money laundering and corruption already have their own legal frameworks. They are already clearly illegal. So when we talk about illicit, we're talking about commercial flows mainly. In any case, we must bear in mind that at all times, the lack of transparency and the motive of hiding money is the knot binding all IFFs. The two-pillar framework of the OECD inclusive framework is sometimes touted as the solution to tax abuse, unbridled tax corruption, and the motivation behind tax havens. It certainly represents some progress, but it is a key problem. But a key problem arising despite the name is that the inclusive framework is not inclusive. Of the only 23 African countries out of 54 were part of the IF at the time the two-pillar solution was arrived at. This was not a coincidence, nor a result of willful ignorance. Rather, it reflected the cost of participation and also the awareness that it's not enough to be present, because it is still possible to be excluded from genuine participation because of global power dynamics. In addition, several studies have shown that Pillar 1 of the IF process does not substantially redress the imbalance in taxing rights and brings very little additional resources, while Pillar 2 could undermine industrial policy objectives. Meanwhile, a troubling development is that signing up to the two-pillar solution is fast becoming a new conditionality for accessing support from international financial institutions or getting debt relief. These are reasons enough to rally around the creation of a UN intergovernmental body as called for by the HLP report. In addition, such a UN body will help to improve African capacities for digitalization of tax administration and for improving tax transparency. Indeed, tackling IFFs effectively provides an opportunity for African countries to get more resources for development instead of depending on aid. Most recent estimates of IFFs from Africa put the scale at about $90 billion annually, which resources can help to meet debt repayments, pay for investments, social services, and climate policy objectives. Despite these obvious benefits, developed countries need to do more to tackle illicit financial flows frontally. Africa-Europe cooperation is one good way to begin to respond to these opportunities and challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us such an insightful and powerful message about what we need to do and why it's so important that we have an approach that is inclusive, that allows African governments to participate on an equal basis, and they aren't caught in a system that then disadvantages them. Let me now pass the floor to Dr. Patrick Olomu, who is the Head of Economic Policy and Sustainable Development at the Africa Union. Now, it's been 8 years since the recommendations from the high-level panel, and it's really important to see how far we've got with those recommendations, and mostly we need to see what's being measured. We just heard from Dr. Dipeolu that we know a lot more now about the size of it, we know where the money's coming from, we know where it's going, we can see some of it. So can I get a sense from you what the AU is doing to monitor this and make this much more visible in your conversation with other governments and other international organizations?
Thank you very much, Tanzin, for giving me the floor. And it is really a true pleasure to be this panel with my elder brother, Adeyemi, who, if he can remember, when I joined the AU in 2013, we were working on this important Mbeki report that has highlighted, the magnitude and the need for stemming illicit financial flows from Africa. Having said that, I would like to, first of all, let you know that the African Union Commission is at the center of the drive towards fighting against illicit financial flows. And for us, this fight is a security and a development, fight, because if you look at the resources that we are losing, they are not just serving to be placed in, foreign jurisdictions, but those resources are also harming the continent because they are fueling insecurity and also deepening poverty and inequalities. So for us, fighting illicit financial flows when we engage with our member states is at the center of all the discussion that we are having. And on that, we have recently created, not recently, but we have created recently the subcommittee on tax and illicit financial flows, which is a policy organ that is looking at those issues of illicit financial flows and the consequences that they are, bringing to African development, going forward. And in this regard, the recent STC subcommittee that we had was held from 31st May to 2 June this year. And in this, discussion, we had, discussed, principally about, the consequences of the increased amount of illicit financial flows that we are losing per year. Because if you may recall, in 2015, we were estimating the losses to about $50 billion per year. And this recently, the statistics are showing that rather than having a reverse, we are even having an increase of that amount that is nearly to be 90 billion now if we look at the data. But in addition to that, what we need to be aware of is that the tax evasion problem that we are all speaking about is also creating an amount of $220 billion per year that African countries are seeing flowing out of the continent because of these, practices of, multinational organizations that are operating within the continent. So you can see that if you take 220 billion plus 90 billion, we are averaging an amount of nearly 10 billion that we are losing per year. If you look at the development needs of the continent, they are estimated by the African Development Bank to be at 472 billion per year to reverse the trends that we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic and to pave the way to sustainable and inclusive development within the continent. And these resources, as it was indicated before, are certainly sleeping in foreign jurisdictions. And we all know where the money is, and we would like to see that money repatriated. So the key question that is asked here about what we have been doing, yes, we are engaging with our member states at the continental level to make sure that they are able to continuously engaging, not only in signing, a declaration during the summits, but to make sure that they are able to fight efficiently against illicit financial flow and also take advantage of the dynamics of the new digitalized economy. So that is what we do within the continent, because fighting against poverty and all those things, creating the right environment is central if we are to tackle illicit financial flows. But at the international level, we are working with our partners as the EU. And you rightly recall that during the last AU-EU summit in Brussels in 2022, February, we have had extensive discussions, on the declaration, because African countries were firm on the fact that there is need to fight efficiently against illicit financial flows, not only at the continental level, but at the global level. And if you look at the declaration, you will see that African countries have been pushing to make sure that there is an engagement of cooperation between Africa and Europe in this critical, development issue. This is, as I said, a security and a developmental issue that we are aiming to tackle with, our policy organs and our member states to make sure that in the next decade, we are able to take advantage of the resources that we have to accelerate progress. The AU, the African Union Commission, is playing a critical role in this interplay because it provides leadership and it provides also advisory, services to member states to make sure that they are able to take advantage of the global dynamics that are surrounding that, that process. But more importantly, and I would like to echo what Adeyemi just underlined on the fact that there is need for a global discussion now on the new tax, the tax cooperation at the United Nations. Because as we said, we are in a rule-based and a power-based world, because the rules are against the continent at the global level, and there is need for us to continuously engaging with our partners to make sure that we are able to create the right environment at the continental and at the global level to make sure that we are able to take advantage of the domestic resource that we are seeking to see increasing in the years to come to exit from debt dependency and also the support that is provided by our partners in terms of aid. So this is what we are trying to do at the AU level, but we remain committed to make sure that we are able to tackle those illicit financial flows. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So again, you've put the highlight very strongly that the European partners need to step up and match that same commitment. And thank you for highlighting some of the areas where the AU is supporting its member states to take action. So now we're passing the hot potato back to Europe. Let me invite our next speaker, and that's Dr. Matt Collin, the senior economist at the EU Tax Observatory and the non-resident fellow at the Centre for Global Development. So Europe is just announcing yet another new flagship initiative. We've got 240 million that's been announced on IFFs and transnational organised crime. But we've just heard that actually we need to get our house in order in terms of the way we tackle tax and the way we allow our multinational companies to shift their profits and through taxing. So, Dr. Collin, have we got any good practice in Europe that we can share? What should we be doing here in Europe to play our part to tackle this?
So I want to start off by saying thank you to the organizers for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to speak more to the bucket of IFFs that encompass corruption, anti-money laundering and tax evasion, not because, as previous speakers have highlighted, it's necessarily the largest proportion of IFFs, but one I think that has a particularly pernicious effect on the political economies of countries that lose through those mechanisms. So one thing I think that's coming out of the conversation is that we're in an evolving worldview in the fight against illicit financial flows. The original worldview was that it was the fault of countries in the global south, those that lose the most from IFFs. It's the fault of those countries for not having the right institutions to fight IFFs and stop them from leaving their borders, to a worldview which I think should demand far more of our attention, where it's countries in the global north that largely act as host or conduits for IFFs. That is, these countries have the greatest capacity to raise the costs of committing tax evasion or corruption around the world. If you look at European countries, if you look at historical cases ranging from Isabel dos Santos's business empire, which covered a lot of European countries, to the Danske Bank scandal in Estonia, to golden passport schemes being run by countries like Malta or Cyprus, or in the past, the United Kingdom. It's mainly European financial and political institutions that have been central to the laundering of corrupt and criminal proceeds from around the globe for quite some time. So the low-hanging fruit isn't necessarily institutional development in African countries, although they do play a role, but it's in the European countries and tax havens that are really facilitating the problem. So I want to highlight two areas where I think some movement would be really important, where there has been progress, but it's kind of stalled. So the first is what I think of as being the tip of the spear in terms of transparency, and that is around beneficial ownership transparency. So this is transparency around the ultimate ownership of companies and assets in European countries. And perhaps the most important step that the EU took in this regard is in the last 10 years, through its fourth and fifth anti-money laundering directives, it established beneficial ownership registries in member states and eventually paved the way to make those registries public. So why would public access to beneficial ownership information be critical? Well, the sad fact is that authorities in European countries don't always have the resources they need to police the quality of those BO registries or use the information in an efficient way for their investigations. And so if you make that information public, you create this many eyes kind of benefit, that you have many more people that can look at the data, enforce the quality of that data. And it also makes it much more efficient for those that need to use it. That's foreign governments, including African governments, journalists, and researchers, to join all the dots that needed to be joined to understand the complex offshore corporate structures that people use to hide their money. Now, all that took a massive step back last year when the European Court of Justice ruled that the public benefit of public access to these beneficial ownership registries did not outweigh the private benefit of just having the privacy. And so those public registers have begun to close down in European countries, removing people's easy access to that information. So the European Parliament now has two options. They can try and decide to fight the ruling and better motivate that justification for public interest, or, in what seems far more likely, unfortunately at this point, move to kind of enforce this restriction that the European Court has put on these registries, that only those with a demonstrated legitimate interest can have access to that information. So that's, that means access to journalists and to competent authorities around the world, but they have to apply for that access, and it's not clear what form that access will take. So right now the onus is on EU countries to make sure their registries are effective, because now they don't have the public to back them up. They need to make sure the information is valid and is very usable by the people that need to use it to follow up in their investigations. And then very quickly, the other area where I think there is drastic need for reform is in the area of what we call blacklists. So these are the kind of coercive measures that international institutions and European countries use to force other countries to adopt international standards, both in the space of anti-money laundering and tax. And these can often carry real economic costs. If you're on an anti-money laundering blacklist, then it's likely that your companies and your banks will face enhanced due diligence measures by global banks. That means higher costs. That means reduced access to the international financial system. If you look at the EU's anti-money laundering blacklist as of today, about 30% of those countries are based in sub-Saharan Africa, despite the fact that they only make up a very small proportion of global GDP, and none of them are really considered major conduits or destination locations for illicit flows. Also, embarrassingly, there's only 2 tax havens on the list, despite the fact that if you look at any financial crime story that's ever been published, tax havens are almost always involved. And even more awkwardly, the way the EU runs both its tax and its anti-money laundering blacklist means that EU countries themselves are exempt from the list. So this is a naming and shaming exercise which is outward facing, but not introspective in any sort of meaningful way. So what I really believe is what we need is a really retargeting of the process of establishing these blacklists, both those maintained by the FATF, but particularly that maintained by the European Union. We have to move from targeting developing countries just because they've been sluggish in their technical compliance with these kind of complex international standards, and move to one that really focuses on countries that really contribute to the global bad of illicit financial flows the most. Those are the jurisdictions that are receiving IFFs and have the most weight in the global financial system. And I do believe the EU Parliament is also pushing for reforms in the way that the EU Commission determines its blacklist. So I think there is some opportunity for change in the near term. So I'll stop there, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you very much. So there we have a problem at the European Court, and so thank you for giving us some of the background. So the court ruled that public's access to documents, the right of public interest and transparency, does not outweigh that of privacy. And you've said there are 2 ways we could deal with that. We could either go back and re-argue, make better justifications, or what's happening now is that countries are sort of preventatively taking down the publicly accessible registries because they don't want to fall foul of that ruling. So thank you. There's something clearly a strong advocacy message there about what we should need to do. Let me invite our next speaker, and that's Alex Cobham, who is the Chief Executive of the Tax Justice Network. And now the name of your organization, I think, says it all. We've been talking about the fact that Money Africa desperately needs to invest in infrastructure to tackle climate change, to develop health systems, education systems, public services, transport. The investment needs of the continent are more or less matched by the amount of money that's flowing out of it. So this is a huge justice issue. Let me find out from you, what have you been seeing in terms of the sort of tools and things that are effective to try and ensure that we have much better sort of measuring and monitoring of these illicit financial flows, and that some of it could stay in Africa?
Thanks, Tamsin, and thanks to the Africa Europe Foundation for the opportunity to speak. I will talk about the technical aspects, although Matt covered a lot of that already. But really, this is a political question, and we too often get lost in thinking it's technical and we should get into the technical details and overlook the importance of political commitment. Tax-related illicit financial flows amount to literally trillions of dollars a year by any of the estimates we have, and the tax revenue losses, according to the latest State of Tax Justice report, which we publish each year, the next one's out at the end of the month. According to the State of Tax Justice, the losses are nearly $500 billion, 483 billion in the last report. Now, those losses are actually bigger in the higher income countries like members of the European Union. But of course, those countries are responsible for a lot of the losses, the majority, suffered by everyone. Lower income countries, including across the African region, suffer the most intense losses. So their losses are biggest as a share of their current tax revenues, or as a share of their public health spending, for example. Sometimes as much as 50% of the public health budget, compared to just perhaps 5% in Europe. That's why we've seen African leadership on this issue for more than a decade now, Going back to the high-level panel, sorry. Going back to the high-level panel on illicit flows out of Africa, really there have been 4 key contributions. One is on definition, where they defined illicit financial flows with corporate tax abuse as a central component. And that is now the formal definition in the United Nations, and that's vital. It stops the multinationals and high-income countries pushing back, saying that tax isn't part of this. Tax is the core element. Secondly, that work has put illicit financial flows into the global agenda, making for the first time, I'm very sorry about this. Making for the first time a global target within the Sustainable Development Goals, 16.4. Perhaps the biggest push that's still highly significant today from the high-level panel was for a globally inclusive architecture, moving tax and illicit financial flows into a UN setting so that every country has a voice, has a say, and is part of the decision-making, something we've never had because the League of Nations and then the OECD has led the way on this and kept out lower-income countries from having a fair say. The final piece that comes from the high-level panel is the regional policy coordination. And Patrick and Adeyemi have touched on this. We've got the Economic Commission for Africa, the African Union Commission, ATAF, CODA, the high-level panel itself continuing its work, all working together to make sure this remains a policy priority and to find coordinated African positions. Then we look to Europe. And we see the absence of pretty much every element of that. At best, there is inconsistency in the European position. As Matt said, there is a willingness to lead on some technical measures, particularly beneficial ownership, some public country-by-country reporting for multinationals, though even that's quite limited, and on research. So the EU is currently funding, for example, a consortium that we're part of at Tax Justice Network called TRACE, which is a project to create dedicated risk-based software for authorities to fight money laundering. But the incoherence is much greater. So Matt's mentioned the non-cooperative jurisdictions list, which systematically targets smaller and lower income countries, as the OECD has done for years in its harmful tax practices approach, and ignores the major threats. EU member states are not considered, and the United States has never been assessed on a level playing field, or it would appear on the list itself. The EU and European nations have also supported the OECD tax process. 10 years in which we have not come to any kind of meaningful solution to curb corporate tax abuse. 10 years in which, despite the creation of the inclusive framework, as Adeyemi said, the decision-making has been anything but inclusive. So we've had lip service to fighting corporate tax abuse and to global inclusivity, but ultimately European countries have continued to back a process at the OECD that is neither effective nor inclusive. And finally, that gives into the uncertain position of European countries on the UN Tax Convention. This is really the greatest opportunity for 100 years for us to fight illicit financial flows by setting inclusively standards for transparency, automatic exchange of information about financial accounts, public registers of beneficial ownership, leading up to a global asset register to support wealth taxation, and public country-by-country reporting by multinational companies to make profit shifting much, much harder and certainly entirely visible, but also to create a UN tax body to set rules for the future, rules that benefit everyone and are effective. We've just had the European Parliament come out and praise the Africa Group for leading the UN resolution last year that has begun intergovernmental negotiations on a UN convention. But still, the European Commission and the European Union and the members have not responded to that very clear call that they should support the process. So that's where we are now, waiting to see if Europe will take the good side in the fight against illicit financial flows, and in September at the UN General Assembly, lend its weight to the leadership of the Africa Group in taking forward formal negotiations on a UN tax convention. Let me stop there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. Really interesting. And again, you are putting it very clearly to us that Europe is missing in action. We've got an absence of nearly every element of what needs to be done to tackle these things. And you've again said this is a political issue and it needs a political solution. So here we are looking at to see what we can do to generate the political will for change. I'm delighted to say that we have Ambassador Sena Son Boteng of Ghana, who's connected. Maybe I could invite you to take the floor and give us a brief response. We've heard that the African partners have made progress. Europe is missing in action. Ambassador, are you with us? Can you please open your microphone? If that's not possible, then I will go to the next person. Yes, please. Hello, go ahead. Ambassador, I can see you on screen as I don't have your camera activated, nor your and your microphone is on mute. So if you'd like to speak, you need to unmute and activate your camera, please. And maybe while we're waiting for that to happen, let me, okay, David McNair, can I invite you to come in on this? I hope you've got a burning strong response to what we've just heard about Europe's inability to deliver on a number of these different issues. David.
Sure, thank you. And Alex used to be my boss, so I entirely agree with his viewpoint. I mean, I think what we're seeing now is, through things like the, the Bridgetown Initiative, and we saw it in Paris last week, is that African leaders are coming together, having weathered a series of exogenous shocks that they had nothing to do with causing, going right back to the global financial crisis, which started in the US housing market. COVID obviously started in China, Ukraine. If you look at historical carbon emissions, Africa is responsible for about 4%. And they're not only frustrated with the fact that they've been, affected by those shocks, but they're also affected by the response. So if you look at, the response of the US, for example, to COVID, a massive fiscal stimulus, which helped drive inflation. And now the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates, which is increasing debt sustainability issues in Africa. And I think the question that's being asked by William Ruto and Cyril Ramaphosa and other leaders is, why don't we have a say in these decisions that are fundamentally affecting the governance of our countries? And I think illicit financial flows is another one of those issues where we're seeing, because of the geopolitical shifts and the great power competition that is happening at the moment, African leaders are increasingly aware of their leverage and are using that to identify specific reforms that they want to see. The most recent being a call for an African Union seat at the G20, which is looking like that will be approved in the coming months. So I think we'll see more and more kind of pressure for this. And that's a very, very good thing. The thing that I think European leaders need to realize is that if we look at the long-term trend lines on demographics, on critical minerals, on migration, all of these issues, Europe actually needs Africa, maybe more than Africa needs Europe. And we need to make our policy decisions and our political decisions in light of that worldview, which I think a lot of European leaders and political advisors haven't really kind of caught up with. But we need to, it's almost like a flip in how we see this relationship. If we were to see that as it is and look at the trend lines as they are, then I think we'd be making some quite different decisions.
Thank you very much, David, again, for reminding us, just how much Africa has been caught in the middle of all of these other different things that affected it, that came from outside without being given a seat at the table to address it, and how this is starting to change and we're seeing shifts in the power dynamics. I'm delighted to invite Isabelle Durand to take the floor, because we've perhaps been using the name of the UN quite a lot in our conversation by saying that's the place where the conversation should happen. If we need to have an inclusive process where we can be fully transparent, where all countries have a say, it needs to happen within the UN framework rather than the OECD or something else. Now, you are from the UN Human Rights Council. So when we talk about issues here about transparency, corruption, justice, legality, how does this have an impact? And how do you see the inability to address IFFs as having a real impact on human rights?
Thank you to give me the floor. So I have not so many technical things to add to what was said by other speakers. I would like to insist on two issues. First, I think that there is a kind of momentum today regarding all the financing for development. And I remember the Paris Forum 2 weeks ago spoke a lot about debt distress, about a lot of issues, but not so much on illicit financial flows. And I think that we have really, all of us, African Union, European Union, and all partners, NGO and others, we have really to address this issue of IFF now, because the Bridgestone agenda that Madame Motley put in place in order to really increase the capacity for developing countries to have more access to finance, illicit financial flows is, of course, an important source. So first, I would like to insist on the importance to work on it and to advocate on that now, in the period from now to the next Paris Forum, the GA in New York in September. It has to become an issue which is repeatedly, permanently repeated by all partners first. Secondly, regarding human rights, of course, I'm no expert on right to development for the Human Rights Council. And it's true that, of course, all this loss of money is totally contributing to the injustice, inequalities, and incapacity to really address human rights issues. So I will, as expert in the expert mechanism on right to development, I will insist on that. And trying not only to develop global ideas on inequalities or I don't know what, but really to work on what has to be done, not only on African side, but also on European side, because we are working in the UN on global level with all countries, even if it's right to development for developing countries, in order to make this illicit financial flow the question that has to be solved. So I can just add that and really insist on the fact that there is a momentum now in the period from now until probably next year. Also in the COP, you know that in the next COP we'll discuss all the fund, green fund, and all those funds that the developing country are asking for adaptation. And I think that we have to repeat permanently the importance to develop a UN body, inclusive body, in order to address this question as it was said. So just that, and be sure that I will follow that closely through the human rights lens.
Thank you very much. And again, you've said the time is now and there are political windows, in the next 12 months at high level for this issue to be put on the table. We are starting to take some of your questions, and I can see a couple in the chat, so thank you. Keep them coming in. I'd like to invite Briggs Bomba, who's a program director at Trust Africa, to comment on what we've just heard. And what strikes me very strongly is when we talk about the IFFs, it's and we talk about this, $80 billion, it sounds like it's just this flow of money. But let's be very clear, this is money from Africa. It is money that Africa could use for its development, for its processes. So this is a form of theft, is it not? That needs to be addressed. When we talk about this, African voices should be the most powerful on this because it's their money that is disappearing. From your perspective at Trust Africa, what are your reflections on the conversation we've just had?
Thank you very much. And I would like to add my appreciation to the Africa-Europe Foundation for the invitation for us to be part of this very important dialogue. Illicit financial flows is one of the key issues that we are working on at Trust Africa. We are a Pan-African foundation that is established on the big idea that those who are most affected by development challenges, those who are most close to the challenges that we are facing, must also have a big voice or must be at the center of creating the solutions to this. So the way that we have come into the conversation on illicit financial flows over several years is to really make sure that the specific ways in which the African continent is affected by illicit financial flows is recognized, and the solutions that we push forward respond to what's the context, the African context of the problem, and the ways in which African countries are affected by this. So from the very beginning, our work has really been about building and strengthening the African voice in the conversation on illicit financial flows. And we've realized that there are different, this is a global problem, but there are differentiated ways in which different countries are affected. The global north is affected differently to the global south. We feature into this story more as the source of illicit financial flows, whereas the global north features mostly as the destination of illicit financial flows. So we've really come in several ways. What we've sought to do is to, at one level, build an ecosystem of actors from the African continent speaking to this issue. So we've been at the center of really investing in building civil society actors that can step forward into the different spaces so that we can push forward the African perspective. But secondly, we've also seen that even the knowledge and the evidence that underpins our advocacy around this question has to be informed by the reality of the problem on the continent. So we have been at the center of investing again in building a knowledge that is coming from the African continent to inform the challenge that we are dealing with. But thirdly, we've really responded to the question that you have just asked, which is to say, this is it's not just statistics, it's not just figures. Yes, we are talking of about $100 billion leaving the continent every year. When you really translate that into social and economic consequences, what it means is that Africa has a massive development financing gap that could be addressed. If you look at the figures that the African Development Bank has given us, our financing gap to meet the Sustainable Development Goals is $200 billion. That's the need that is there. And we are losing about $100 billion through illicit financial flows. And we think if we were to plug that, we'll be able to move in a very big way. But also, if you look at the statistics that have come from UNCTAD, countries that are more susceptible to illicit financial flows are spending close to 60% less on public health than countries that are less affected by illicit financial flows. And you see the same issue replicated even when you look at the question of education, investments in education. So we really see this as an issue that speaks to real lives and how people are affected. And then if you look at the current reality on the continent with the whole debt crisis that is affecting the continent, the development financing needs of the continent have even become much, much more pronounced. So one of the issues that we have responded to comes from the high-level panel that President Mbeki chaired. And he said, solving this problem is not just a matter of technical solutions. It's an issue of political will. So we believe that political will arises from African citizens becoming invested in this issue and really realizing that this has real consequences on their access to public education, their access to health, their access to infrastructure, their access to public services in a big way. And our investment now has been around building that citizen voice so that we can compel political will on our leadership. Because the question you asked earlier on was, what progress are we making, and what explains, some of the slow progress that we are making. So to that end, we have been at the center of creating what is known as the Stop the Bleeding campaign. And this is the campaign that brings together several Pan-African institutions, people across the continent, from faith-based groups, from trade unions, students' movements, different civil society actors, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, to come into a common platform that really demonstrates that this is a matter that connects to citizens, and this is a matter that citizens care about, and this is a matter that we want our political leadership to place at the center. So we are seeing that through some of those ways that shifts the conversation, maybe from being a very technical issue, an expert issue, and bring in citizens into the equation. We're actually beginning to see that there are responses that then comes from our political leadership. And we really think that that's going to be a key issue in terms of resolving the matter that President Mbeki spoke about when he brought to the center this question of political will. Then I want to say a couple of things in terms of what we see as some of the barriers to progress, because we've been having this conversation for quite a while now. From our end, we think that there is not sufficient global North, global South cooperation around this question. This is a global question. And to that end, we really salute the efforts that are coming from Africa-Europe Foundation in terms of creating dialogue platforms such as this. To solve the problems that are before us, we are really going to need that level of cooperation. But secondly, we also think that there is not enough multi-stakeholder engagement. We even move it to the level of compacts. Because if you look at what is happening now, if we put forward a figure that says $90 billion is lost from the continent every year, the private sector actors step forward and say they question the methodologies that you have used to arrive at that figure. So we think that there's a certain level of fragmentation that is undermining the progress that we can make. And we believe that for us to be able to move forward, we're going to need to invest a lot more in a multi-stakeholder process that brings together the private sector, multinational corporations, civil society, African governments, key European actors, key global North actors, let me say, so that we can develop a compact where we will not be slowed down and will not be having some of these issues questioned. And then the last thing that I would mention is that we also think that a lot of what we are trying to address right now arises from how the current global financial architecture is structured. Historically, and in terms of some of the new ways that it has emerged, it is designed to make sure that wealth that is generated from the continent somehow finds its way moving to the global North. So the conversations that are coming up in terms of reform of the global financial architecture so that it becomes more just and it addresses some of the historical injustices through which the African continent is integrated into the global economy are quite critical, including this conversation around the UN Tax Convention that my fellow panelists have already mentioned. So let me leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Briggs. And we've already had a couple of people who've commented who've agreed with you that we need a new narrative. We need to bring everyone around the table. And this includes the private sector, civil society, as well as governments, as we have this conversation about a new global financial architecture. Let me invite Mr. Willard Mapalunga, the Programme Officer from Sustainable Finance at the Africa Climate Foundation, to reflect on this. And particularly, I think, in the perspective of the huge financing needs for adaptation and preparing for climate change and mitigation. I would imagine that this is a really important part of the picture of helping Africa to prepare and be more resilient for climate change. What's your perspective? Willard, if I could get you, yeah, there you are, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that question. But before I reflect on your question, I would like to just bring in like one or two issues into perspective and really building on what my colleagues Mo Ibrahim and others have already alluded to. My understanding is that the issue of illicit financial flows is a multilateral discourse, right? And I think the framing of this such like kind of a meeting like this one, as a dialogue, as we are putting it, is important in terms of how we need to understand how developed countries and poor countries meet on eye to eye on such issues, right? So we need to have very candid conversations around how do we tackle IFFs. But I'll come back to this conversation just briefly. So if this dialogue,
I think we might have lost Willard. Apologies if we've had a connection problem. I think we've lost that connection. We'll come back to it as soon as we can reestablish that. We're about to start moving to the open part of the conversation where I take some of your questions. And thank you, we've had a couple in the chat already that were ready to go forward. But Bombas made it very clear, we need to get citizens involved. And at the Africa Europe Foundation, we strongly believe in the role of citizens. And I'm delighted that we have already a citizens question that's come forward. And to introduce that, I'm going to invite Tanda, who's our citizen engagement manager, to tell us how this issue of IFFs is being picked up in the conversations that we're having with different citizen groups, and to introduce our citizen person. Here, go ahead, Tanda.
Thank you, Tamsin. The Africa Europe Foundation recently published a focus group report on governance and finance reform. Speaking on the importance of African voices, we spoke to 100 young Africans on the continent, and the issue of mismanagement of financial resources and the cost to Africa's development was a major theme. In fact, I have a question from one of those citizens, Alexander Thomas from Ghana, who asks, how can we enhance transparency, strengthen regulatory frameworks, and promote international cooperation to effectively tackle IFFs?
Thomas? Alexander Thomas from Ghana. Can we connect you? Apologies, I think we don't have that connection. So let me move to a couple of questions that we've got in our chat. And we've got a question from Folajimi Ashiru, and this is an interesting one, because they've said, look, understanding all of these issues, where do we start? Do we attempt to tackle all of the historical IFFs? And we've heard that, we've lost over the last 50 years, more than $1 trillion. So do we try and tackle that? Or do we sort of clean slate moving forward and set the new rules and try to stop future IFFs? So members of the panel, what do you think? Where should we be putting our attention? Do we just let bygones be bygones and make sure that nothing more can happen in the future? Or should we try to retrospectively unpick some of the things that have been done? So Dr. Olomo, do you have a response on that?
Thank you very much, Tamsin, and this is quite an interesting question. Yes, in fact, the sequencing of the actions that we need to conduct is certainly not clear. But what we strongly believe is that we need to focus now on tackling illicit financial flows going forward to make sure that we are able to reduce the spread of those resources that are going out of the continent. That is one. But as we are doing that, there is need also to look back and to make sure that we are able to track and repatriate the amount of money that we are already lost, which is an amount of about more than $1 trillion US, as you said. This is a huge amount of money that needs to be transferred to the continent to make sure that we are able to accelerate our development. And why do we say that? Because if you look at the development dynamics, you will see that commitments are made at the global level to address, global issues, including, stemming illicit financial flows, and also repatriating the amount of money that was already lost by the continent. And there is an initiative within the continent that is specifically speaking to that, which is the CAPA, the Common African Position on, recovery of lost assets. And Adeyemi will certainly give the right spelling. But this is something that the African Union Commission is spearheading to make sure that we are able to bring back the resources that we have lost. So it is a two-front fight, in our view, that needs to make sure that going forward, we are able to stem illicit financial flows, and that we are also able to repatriate the amount of money that we have, been losing during, the 50 years that we have said. And it is here that you see the issue of credibility and accountability, coming forward. Because when you look at the global discussions, there is, an agreement that the resources should be repatriated to Africa. But practically, what have we seen achieved? I think there are some countries like Nigeria who have been able to repatriate a little amount of money, on the huge resources that they have been losing in the 50 years that we have alluded to. So there is need for, a global consensus on the need for repatriation of those resources to make sure that we are able to get those resources back to accelerate progress towards, structural transformation. This is critical because if we say that we are in a context where commitments are made and commitments are met, there is need for us to focus on, critical actions that are implementing the decisions that we are taking at the global level. Thank you very much. I will have to give back the floor.
Thank you. Adeyemi Dipeolu, you've raised your hand. Would you like to respond?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And it's quite an exciting session so far. Just to say that I think it's a very good question, especially in view of limited capacities. But I don't think it's an either-or situation. The truth of the matter is that recovery is equally important. The high-level panel showed, for instance, that the US was able to use its Lacey Act to repatriate illicit flows from fishing proceeds. We know about the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative. CAPA has been mentioned by Patrick, the Common African Position on Asset Recovery. But we also know that one of the key elements that revenue agencies use is to recover proceeds from tax evasion. It's never really ever written off, partly because, of course, of the signaling, and partly because of the whole idea of moral hazard if we are not careful. So we must indeed work hard to bring everybody on board so that we can get results going forward. But we cannot signal that it's okay to have taken what you took away. And as you recall, with our artifacts that were taken away in the colonial era, we continue to recover them. And so we're not going to give that signal that we're not going to focus on recovery. We just have to learn to clap with both hands. Thank you.
Thank you. Learning to clap with both hands. I think that's a good message for us to take forward. Other members of the panel, Mo, you wanted to come in, and I've also seen Alex and Matt with their hands up. Mo, go ahead.
It is a big fight to really get our partners in Europe and US
I'm sorry, you're not coming through very clearly. Maybe you could speak closer to the microphone?
Okay. Is it better now?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. I just saying that it is a big battle to try to stop this illicit flow of funds at the moment. And I'm just worried about raising the issue of the past misdeeds over 50 years in parallel with this, because that we're going to give ammunition for the people who are resisting moving forward to move the discussion to the other side. And there's going to be a lot of issue coming back. You're trying to recover money for dead people, companies which already gone bankrupt or bought by another company, and it's going to be a very complicated issue. Let us fight this one now. Get this done now to stop that bleeding, and after we win this battle, maybe we can raise the other issue. Just to be practical, how to pick our fights, because we are in danger of losing the fight, because we're gonna have another debate about what is the past. Look, I mean, at the argument about climate. I mean, the people who put all this carbon up there over the last 200 or 300 years, it's very difficult for a problem which is affecting everybody to try to convince people to really deal with past misdeeds. I just really think we need to focus on stopping the bleeding now, and if we win this, maybe you can raise other question.
Thank you.
I just be pragmatic, yeah.
You know, I just wrote down it on my notes, very pragmatic response there from Mo, so very clear, because we don't want to run into the wall of resistance that's been existing for the last 50 years. Now, I know that Matt and Alex wanted to respond on that, but just let me highlight to you, got two other questions in the chat that I think are interesting that you might want to reflect on. There's one that said, look, a lot of countries in Africa, a significant part of the economy is informal. So how do we measure the impact or role of IFFs in the informal economy? And that's an interesting point you might want to reflect on, panelists. And the second question that I think is great that says, look, the incentives for Africa to try to stop the IFFs are very clear. What's the incentive for Europe? This is a political problem. We haven't found the political will, so what's the incentive? So Matt and Alex, you're both asked for the floor. You're welcome to respond on any of those questions. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks. I'd agree with Mo that we need to focus right now on stopping the clock. On, you know, every minute, every second, there is a further extraction of wealth from countries in the global south, and we have to stop the clock. We have to stop that debt that is owed by the global north from building any further. But I think politically it can be useful to recognise that effectively we're in the third age of illicit flows, all of which have gone in one direction, starting with the violent extraction under formal empire. So our kind of baseline shouldn't be getting to zero next year. It should be some kind of reparative response to the past. And that ought to at least influence where we think a fair deal today looks like. So I think it's worth us keeping that in mind, even if we are largely pragmatic in what we're looking for right now. Picking up those other couple of questions, look, the informal sector is something that's continually brought up, particularly by multinational companies and their professional advisors, who are basically saying, look over there, there's something else to think about. There's an informal sector in every country. You know, I live in Spain where, you know, the informal sector is extremely large and has continued to be since the fall of the dictatorship, not so many decades ago. And this is often, as with countries that were colonized, this is often part of the effects of having an illegitimate government in control for a sustained period of time, that the strength of the social contract isn't what it might be, and people's tax morale is not as strong as it can be once governments have had longer, or that the system of government has had longer to develop its legitimacy. You know, that's why somebody like Nkrumah came to power, leading the charge with the cry that, for independence to work, you had to pay your taxes as an act of patriotism, despite the fact that tax had always been used as a tool of oppression by the empire. So it's turning that dynamic around is harder, and that's true in countries in Europe like Spain, Greece, and Portugal, Italy, that have relatively recently had illegitimate governments too. So it is something to think about, but it's not really closely related to illicit financial flows that cross borders. And this is where we need to begin with this. And so that takes to the last question: what's in it for Europe? That European countries are the biggest losers in absolute terms, with the exception of the United States and a couple of others, from illicit financial flows in terms of their own taxes. And Europe is facing a crisis, or a set of interlocking crises of inequality, deep social and overlapping inequalities, particularly affecting women, affecting marginalized people of many types. It's also facing a crisis of climate, like the rest of the world. And these things take money. They take money to respond to, they take effective states, and we need states that can raise progressive taxation to fight inequalities and generate the resources to deliver the kind of societies that we all want, whether we're in Europe or anywhere else in the world. So the political will should not be an issue. Governments have continually said since the global financial crisis that they largely caused, we are raising revenues, we are cracking down on corporate tax abuse, but the numbers show they haven't. If anything, corporate tax abuse has grown year on year. The losses suffered in Europe, as elsewhere, have grown year on year. What's lacking here, though, because politicians do not see the light, they feel the heat. What's lacking is a sustained political mobilization within Europe to demand that our governments do better. Something that, I think we can say African civil society has been much, much more effective, including with, various groups that Bomba knows and Tax Justice Network Africa in particular, at mobilizing citizens to demand their governments do better. There's another challenge there for us in Europe, because again, we're not coming up to the mark.
Thanks, Alex. Briggs, I know you've got your hand up, and then Matt, I might come back to you. Briggs, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to say definitely the starting point is stopping the bleeding. And I'm quite happy to hear that, coming from the different colleagues on the panel. But I think a big part of what we need to do is really around reforming the global financial architecture, so that it does not produce the results that it is currently producing. We don't have a lot of time, but if you look at the way that taxation is structured, why base erosion and profit shifting is a problem for the African continent currently, is because the global taxation rules were last negotiated fundamentally at the end of the First World War, when the nature of global corporations was completely different to what we are dealing with right now. So Africa, as a so-called capital importing continent, had the rights to tax profits, whereas the capital exporting countries had the rights to tax return on investments. So I think the reason why Alex's point earlier was important around this country by country reporting is such that you can play the current rules and ensure that you don't declare any profits. We have a big case in Zambia, Glencore, where they made more than $15 billion and paid zero tax on that. Even if you look at the high-level panel report that President Mbeki championed, you had specific examples of countries that would, companies that would go for more than 10 years without declaring any tax, but they were still operating. So you really need to reform global taxation rules so that we do not have this big disadvantage that we currently have as the continent. And secondly, and lastly, is the whole conversation that we are having around the reform of the global financial architecture, I think Mo made a point earlier on. He mentioned financial engineering. I think we really need to pay attention to the financial engineering that is allowable under the current financialization that defines the global financial architecture. There's so much that can be done without falling under any regulation, without needing any licensing, that ultimately results in the unjust flow of finance and other assets or wealth from the continent to the global north. So we really need to look at how do we reform the global financial architecture so that some of this financial engineering is disciplined. If you look at all the financial crises we've had, including the very last one in the US, 2008, it was as a result of completely unregulated finance. You could do whatever you wanted to do, and there were massive negative consequences to society. So we really need to reform the global financial architecture so that we neutralize some of these disadvantages for the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Dr. Donald Kaberuka from Southbridge. If you'd like to come in and make a comment, we'd be very much welcome your insight. If you could put your camera on so I could then see you on screen, that would be great. I think you want to contribute. And maybe while we're sorting that out, Matt, would you like to make a quick comment?
Hello?
Yeah. Someone speaking.
Hello, my name is Linka. I'm Dr. Kaberuka's assistant. He just left for an urgent meeting. As soon as he's back in the office, before the meeting ends, he'll probably make his comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, we'd be delighted if he's able to join us. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll touch quickly on the problem of incentives for European countries and a little bit on the past and future. So I think if there was any time that the incentives for European countries to clean up shop was more evident, it was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This was a moment where suddenly we needed to enact a whole host of sanctions against a foreign actor, and we really fell short because we just didn't have the transparency apparatus in place to really enforce those sanctions, and they became a lot less sticky than they otherwise might have been. So there's this kind of ability to kind of enforce, your will upon other countries, which is reduced if you don't have the transparency in place. As Alex pointed out, there's a personal incentive as well. When the UK opened up its register of overseas entities that own property, it's a beneficial ownership registry for property held in the UK. A good 30% of the people that held property in the UK through overseas companies were British citizens themselves, likely engaging in some form of evasion or avoidance. And so there's a real incentive to clean up shop at home because it's going to make a difference for your own state coffers as well as those for overseas. And then finally, I think it helps for the moral argument. So right now, the way that the discourse around IFFs is imagine you wake up in the middle of the night and you realize someone's broken into your house and stolen your TV, and you trace the person across the street to your neighbor's house. You knock on the door and say, hey, my TV's in there. And your neighbor says, I can't really help you with that, but I can help you change the locks in your door if that would be useful. That's kind of the discourse right now between countries in the global north and countries in the global south, where countries in the global north just can't really track down assets. Asset recovery is frankly a global embarrassment, how little is tracked, traced, and returned. And if they can improve their ability to recoup those assets, and I think going back to the previous question, there's no friction between new policies in doing so, because things like beneficial ownership registries, new reporting requirements will just make it much more likely that we're going to pick up on old assets and return them. I think that's going to give European countries a bigger moral, leverage in the argument about improving policies elsewhere as well.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, we're delighted to see you on screen. Please go ahead. You need to unmute because we can't hear you. There we are.
Thank you very much, dear moderator. And Mo, thank you as usual for bringing us such a lively debate. I just have a question, and to the AU. At the EU, through FATF, we have the list of high-risk jurisdictions that is listed when you are, they find deficiencies in your financial system on money laundering and to counter the financing of terrorism. And we also have a list that is published occasionally or periodically on countries that are not complying with tax, the required tax governance. Why is it that till today, the AU cannot come up also with such a list so that we also name and shame? Because we are named and shamed all the time. Of course, we do appreciate these lists also help us to fix deficiencies in our financial systems, which we are enjoined to. So if we do realize that there are illicit flows of finances, why is it that up till now we also cannot come up with a robust list that will name and shame whoever is found to be doing the wrong thing? Because to date, we talk, we discuss, we cry, but the monies, we are still bleeding. And bleeding, we still shall. Mo, thank you very much for this, this event, and I hope that we continue talking and find some system we can also put in place to fix what is happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Patrick, I'm going to bring you in because we had a direct question there for the AU, so it's a perfect time for you to come in and respond.
Thank you very much, Tamzin. Yes, Ambassador, your question is certainly very interesting and important. But let me give you, the dynamics of the game, because we have to understand where we are, in the world in which we are evolving today. I'm just taking an example, and I think that this conversation is one of the critical conversations that we've had since the last AU-EU summit. And I would like to thank the organizers of this session, because I can see that at least we have a platform to express our views, frankly and freely. Having said that, what I would like to say is that I'm just taking an example. When the Russia-Ukraine started, as African countries, we were called upon to take, a side. And taking a side, had consequences on our countries, because as I said at the beginning, we are in a power-based and a rule-based world. Those who have power, can impose to you even the way you think and even the way you do things. And this is specifically what we are trying to dismantle now, to make sure that when there is an African position on one critical issue, we are not listening to, the say of our partners who have the power to, to push us to the direction where they want us to be leaded to. So we are trying to do that, and we are doing it successfully, because in the Russia-Ukraine, consequent crisis, we have not taken a side, and we have been able to make sure that our partner understand that we are not going to, take the side of one, part and, against the others. Responding to this issue of also coming out with a list of countries, in terms of, those who are doing the wrong things. Ambassador, let me tell you that the moment you start crafting that list, your country, which certainly is looking for support for the global financial architecture, will never receive that support. You will never receive it. Just an example, a little example. The same crisis. Last year, sub-Saharan countries, combined, were able to receive with, Nigeria and South Africa in that group, were able to receive an amount approximately of $1 billion from the, international financial system. But another country who was facing, maybe similar problems, received an amount of $15.6 billion US, just like that. So it tells you how things are working. The moment you will craft that, you are sure that you get into the blacklist of people or of countries that are not able to be financed. So at the AU, we are trying to have an approach that is certainly pragmatic, but also that is, protecting the interests of our countries when we are engaging in these discussions, to make sure that when we are pushing for our position, we are not going to the extent which we create tensions that are going to lead us, to some little difficulties that are going to hamper or to harm the development process of our countries. Having said that, it responds also to the issue of repatriation of stolen assets that we are talking about, because how can you understand that? We all know where the money is sleeping. We all know where the resources are. If we are committed to development and that we are pushing to have a world in which commitments are made and a world in which we are implementing the decisions that we are making at the global level, I don't know if we should have that discussion of trying to know if the money will be repatriated or not. The money just needs to be repatriated without further conditions. But unfortunately, we are faced with conditionalities when we are asking for the money to be repatriated. In addition to that, if you look at the stolen assets, since centuries, and I would like to thank Mo for his frank speech on that. It is true that if we start asking that, we will certainly deviate the conversation, but this is just the way things are evolving. But as Africans, we should not be shy of asking the money to be repatriated or the stolen assets that were taken from us in the colonial period to be coming back to Africa. And I can tell you, Tamzin, that during the AU-EU negotiations, that was one of the critical points in which African countries stepped out and said, we need our stolen assets to be repatriated. But unfortunately, you will see that in the other side of our partners, they are not willing to do that. They are not willing to do that. So it poses a simple question. What are we then doing together if we are not able to implement, the agreed actions that we have said we will implement? And this is where you will see that the leakage will continue until, on the other side of our partners, people understand that we need to stop that. Because as Mo said, these financial engineering processes that multinationals are using, they are well known. We all know what they are doing. But unfortunately, our countries are seeking to invest in those critical sectors. Let's take, for instance, now the transition to the green, the green transition with the electric vehicle, battery vehicle. If you see the trends of investment today, African countries are saying we should transform those resources within the continent to make sure that we are creating jobs and that we are strengthening growth to make sure that we are able to accelerate productive transformation. But unfortunately, when you see the deals that are signed, you will see that completely different deals are being signed. But this is not even in respect of the engagement that we have taken, during the AU-EU summit. So the question is there, what do we do? The AU is committed to do it. We are doing it, as I said, in respect to the international, agreed principles, and we are doing it to make sure that we are safeguarding the interests of our member states, because at the end of the day, their interest should be at the forefront of all the actions that we are taking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very honest and a very clear message to us all. And that brings me back to the point that we said earlier, which is this is a political challenge and it will require political discussions to address it. I know that had more people who wanted to take the floor, and we have lots of questions that arrived in the chat, but we've run out of time, which tells us that this was a hot issue that people wanted to discuss. The one thing I will say on this, because we're out of time in this conversation, is it's very clear this is a conversation that needs to grow. We heard from Briggs, and thank you for putting that on the table. We need to keep talking and to broaden the number of people who are at the table so that we can bring that pressure together with civil society, with the private sector and government. So at the Africa Europe Foundation, we know that this conversation is not over, and we will probably continue it in some form or another. But let me now hand over to our co-founder, to Mo Ibrahim, to make some concluding remarks. And I don't envy you. It's going to be tough to summarize some of the great range of things that we talked about. But Mo, the floor's yours.
Thank you very much, Didi, and well done.
Microphone problems again. Could we get you to speak?
We got it now.
Better, much better.
Very well then. I just want to say thank you very much, really, for managing really a big discussion here with too many participants. Well done. And I really wish also to thank our panelists for their valuable contribution. And I want to ask Alex that when they produce the report from the CGD next month, to make sure to communicate it widely, because we are all interested in that. And that will help actually the discussion going forward. I just have just few remarks. One about the European Court and in my view, the misguided ruling they produced. I'm not sure that the case was put properly to them when they balanced transparency against privacy. And the case really should have been put as that of $100 billion a year in Africa. That would mean saving lives, it means hospitals, less women dying in during delivery, and more kids in schools, less immigrants to Europe. This what is, and this is mean lives for people, saving people, and that how to weigh the argument instead of moving into illegal wrangling. And I think the European Union should take this case forward. And I'm happy to go and offer my services free of charge. I'm not a lawyer, but I think I can tell those judges the cost to Africans and lives of this stolen money. So that's one point. The resolution by the Africa-Europe Summit last year, which they made the resolution, we're going to stop this. And then they asked our foundation, the Africa-Europe Foundation, to really monitor now the implementation of these resolutions and promises. And well, I think that's a big mistake, because they're going to take that very seriously, and we need to hold them really to account on implementing what they said they're going to do. So this conversation will not stop here. Our work will not stop here. We need to continue to pressure that. I need to bring this to the center of the discussion. You guys want to stop illegal immigrants? The only way is to the Horn of Africa. Climate change, all this stuff. And that is much more important than arguing about aid money, etc. Because this illicit flow of financial resources really dwarf all the aid money was being offered to us. One thing interesting is in any discussion with our friends in the European Union, we are always told about about European values. European values at the center of the European project. And we need again to say, okay, here we are, where are your values? We really need action here, because this affecting the lives of our people. People need to understand that. And with this, I just repeat my gratitude for our wonderful panelists. And we really wish this conversation to continue and to go forward. We will not stop until it's done. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And it was a very lively conversation, lots of input in the chat. And thank you very much for people suggesting that you'd like to be part of a follow-up conversation or contribute, because we see that is absolutely key. Just to mark in your diaries, the next in our AU-EU Tracker Special Dialogues will be on the 7th of September. And there we're going to be tackling the issue on youth skills, green jobs and the new economy. And of course, just as a reminder, this is the European Year of Skills, so it's a key focus. And given the demographics of Africa, youth skills is also a key contribution to the economy. So we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you all for participating, and watch this space as we will open up further dialogues on the IFF framework. Thank you and goodbye from Brussels.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.